everybody. Welcome to Rachel's Reviews. With the release of the new Lion King, everybody's talking about remakes. That's the big subject on everybody's mind. And Disney has been doing these live action remakes. They've been pumping them out. And I think The Lion King is the one that we thought, oh, they're never going to touch that. It's so beloved. It's so special to so many people. But yet, here we have it. And so I thought it would be fun to talk about what makes a remake work, what makes a good remake, what makes them not work. And I couldn't think of anybody better to bring on to talk about this subject than my good friend Sean Chandler is here. So Sean, thanks so much for coming on the channel.
Thanks so much for having me. It'll be fun to talk about remakes. There's a lot of spicy opinions on this one.
That's for sure. And so, Sean, let's talk first. What exactly is a remake? That sounds like an obvious question, but in your mind, what's the difference between a remake and a reboot and also just an adaptation? Because some people, like for instance, all the different versions of Christmas Carol, that's not a remake.
Right.
It's just a new adaptation of the story. And I think sometimes movies that get lumped in with remakes are, I don't know, like Tim Burton's Alice in Wonderland. Is that really a remake? It's just a new version of Alice in Wonderland.
Right.
It's not really remaking the Disney animated classic.
Yeah, so I see a remake is when you go back to a specific creation, a specific version of a story, and you remake that story. You retell that version of the story. A reboot is when you kind of start over the continuity, but not necessarily tell that story again. So like with Batman, they keep rebooting Batman, but they're not remaking Batman. And then as you mentioned, a readaptation is when there's some additional source material out there and people keep going back to the original material. Jungle Book, Mowgli being an example of that, where people are like, hey, why didn't you include Mowgli in your live action remakes of Disney, or Tarzan? Why didn't you include Tarzan in your video about live action remakes? Because those are readaptations. They're not remakes of the Disney version of the story, where some of these other ones are actually, they're going back, like Aladdin. They went and they took Aladdin and they converted it to live action. Lion King, they very clearly adapted it straight to photorealistic CGI, whatever you call this thing. But it's so remake the same story, the same version told again, reboot, restarting the continuity, but not necessarily the same story, but more like continuing the characters in a new way, readaptation, going back to the source material and telling the story again, but based off the source material.
Yeah, that's right. And sometimes it can get a little muddled. Like I think the 2015 Cinderella is a good example of this, because it's really just a different take on Cinderella, because they don't use any of the songs. They don't, there's it's obviously, it's got all the beats of Cinderella, but I don't know. I think it's pretty its own thing.
Or Mulan. The people are getting worked up like, wait a minute, you're not including this character in the remake of Mulan. Well, Mulan predates the movie from 20 years ago by a lot. And that character that you're worried about has not been around for very long. And so it gets confused because they're calling it a remake, but it's a readaptation remake thing.
Yeah. I think if it had the songs, then I think this case is stronger that it is a remake, because that's so iconic to the original, to the Disney version of that story. But if they don't have the songs, I feel like it's like, I don't know, there's just been so many versions of Cinderella over the years. A Slipper in the Rose is not a remake of the Disney animated classic. And so I think that's where it gets a little bit muddled. But yeah, and what do you think is the difference between a reboot and a remake?
I think a remake, it's a specific version of a story. Like it goes back to story, and reboot is characters. Like the characters are starting over in a new continuity. And it gets even more confusing because they use the term reboot, but it's not even a reboot of the continuity. It's just like, hey, we haven't done this in 20 years. Let's continue it. So, and sometimes they use soft reboot when they do that. Like, all right, it's kind of a continuation. So it's like a soft reboot, but it's been 10 years. So we're trying to like start new, fresh for a new group of people. Or a soft remake like The Force Awakens, which hits a lot of the same beats as A New Hope, but it's a new story at the same time. But like, there's a reason that a lot of people are like, it's the same thing, because very clearly they were trying to touch on the same stuff. So it's kind of like a soft remake. So,
yeah, that's true. That's a good example. Or, a reboot is kind of more a franchise
yeah,
that they're start kind of introducing again.
Right.
Like every time they reboot Batman, for instance, they don't really have to have seen the other versions in order to understand this new version.
Right. And people be like, hey, Christopher Nolan remade Tim Burton's Batman. Not at all. Like, no. Tim Burton's Batman was a very distinct story and interpretation of everything, and Nolan's was his own interpretation. Like, they're readapting the source material, they're rebooting the continuity. So it could be those other two categories we talked about, a readaptation and a reboot, but it's not remaking that story. If you're remaking Tim Burton's Batman, then you are going back to this Vicky Vale, Jack Nicholson interpretation of the Joker, Bob the Goon, all of that fun stuff. And then, maybe Prince will have some Prince songs. That's Tim Burton's Batman, that you could remake that. You reboot Batman. Matt Reeves is rebooting Batman, readapting Batman, not remaking Batman.
Yeah, and of course you have a sequel, which is sometimes gets a little muddled because, again, to use Tim Burton's Alice in Wonderland, I mean, technically it's actually a sequel. There's a few moments in the movie where she talks about, I'm remembering this before, and they've all met Alice before, and so, but it's not really a sequel. I know, so it gets a little muddled, but yeah, if you want to be super technical. Or Maleficent,
right?
It has so many beats from the that are similar, like the christening scene and things like that are similar, and yet technically some might say that that's a sequel or a reboot, or it gets a little muddled, but
sidequel, side boot. I don't know.
Yeah, that's right. So, well, let's talk about some of our favorites. I actually came up with quite a long list of remakes that I enjoy. People think I just hate remakes, but I haven't even hated all of the Disney live action remakes. I hate the way they're usually marketed. Disney makes me crazy the way that they usually phrase it as some kind of upgrade to animation, which just makes me kind of sad, because I feel like they are intentionally kind of messing with their legacy in order to puff up these new films. Like, they just don't care, and that makes me sad. And when I think a good remake is just confident in what it has to offer, and you don't need to put down the original and be like, we've upgraded it, we've made it so much better, we've made it more modern. And I hate that. And it was the worst. Beauty and the Beast about killed me. It was so frustrating.
Well, finally, Belle's a strong, independent woman that's intelligent. Finally, they fixed the character.
Right. It was so frustrating. And so, yeah, but I haven't hated all of those. I really do actually like the Cinderella quite a bit. I think
that's my favorite of the bunch.
Mm-hmm. I think Kate Blanchett's so great as Lady Tremaine, and I think they had a really nice message of kindness and courage, and I think that works really well. And I like that they didn't use the songs and kind of tried to make it its own thing with its own message and its own ideas, and it just little things that I thought worked. I thought they made meaningful changes without like being stupid and irritating.
Yeah, well, and it's just such an elegant, respectful interpretation of the story that has a nice little charm to it. That it's just like you're watching it. It's like, it feels like you guys just nailed the tone of how to not do the songs, but do this version of it that still has all the magic.
Yeah. When I first saw her dress, I was like, oh, I don't like this dress at all. What is this thing? But then the way they used it in the movie, I actually really liked, because she wanted to keep it in certain ways because it was her mother's dress. So they didn't want the full transformation. And so then I was like, oh, that's a meaningful change. And you're making it your own, but with purpose. So I appreciated that. And Lily James was wonderful in the role. And so that's I love Pete's Dragon, but I feel like Pete's Dragon is really only a remake in name only.
Yeah.
It's just basically a a boy and his dragon story, because it has almost nothing to do with the original.
Right. All the stuff that I remember from watching the original one with the, traveling steak oil salesman, like all the distinctive things, like those aren't in the new one at all. It's like its own thing.
Yeah, that I enjoy. One of my favorite movies of all time is You've Got Mail, and that's a remake. And I think the reason why that's done so well is because they just take the core concept of The Shop Around the Corner, and they give it a modern take. And Nora Ephron's writing is so great that it elevates anything that she does, and it's just so brilliant to have Tom Hanks, who many say is sort of a modern Jimmy Stewart, to have him play the Jimmy Stewart character. That's brilliant. And I love it. I think it's so funny. I think it's so witty. And I love both movies. But if I were to pick, I would prefer You've Got Mail over Shop Around the Corner. But I do love both.
I think every single video we've ever done together, You've Got Mail has come up.
Yeah.
No matter what we talk about.
I love it. I think it's so funny. It's just one of my all-time favorites. So, so that's one that I like. What's a remake that you enjoy?
All right, so I'll go through some that kind of come to mind. And mine going in a very different direction from yours. The Dawn of the Dead remake. It's Zack Snyder's first film, so I imagine this is probably not right up your alley. But it just kind of takes the basic plot of the original Dawn of the Dead and a lot of the similar kind of messaging of the original film, and just gives it like a 21st century upgrade. It's not really competing because it has just such a different pacing and energy to it that it, like, if you want a classic old school zombie movie, the original one's there, and if you want kind of this 21st century rock and roll zombie movie, you have two things. They both exist, and they both do what they're trying to do really well, with a distinct style, a distinct flavor to them. The characters inside the story are pretty different from one another, and so it takes the themes, ideas, and interprets them in two different centuries. So that's one that comes to mind that some people don't even immediately think is like, oh yeah, that is a great remake. Then Ocean's 11.
Yeah, I had that on my list as well.
And that's one that, most people haven't even seen I haven't seen the original one, because the current one just popped so much on its own. And they took like, hey, let's kind of take, this 40, 50, now it's, over 50 years old at the time, about 40-year-old movie, and kind of do the modern version of that, of like, let's just get a fantastic cast. Let's get a real director with a distinct flavor, voice, style to what he does, and make just a really fun heist movie. And it just stands so much on its own because of that you don't even think about it in the terms of remake, though it's like in your head, that it is.
Yeah, I actually prefer it to the original. In that case, it's just got a little bit more energy, and I mean, I love, obviously you love Frank Sinatra, Dean Martin, that whole thing, but I don't know, I really enjoyed that. A couple others that I have on my list. I really like the remake of The Italian Job. I think that is really fun. I like the action in that, and I think it's a really fun little movie. I really like The Parent Trap remake. I still think it's Nancy Meyer's best movie, and I love both, but I think that they both do a good job. I really like the new reboot, I guess, of the Planet of the Apes movies.
Yep.
I think are very well done. They have their own style, their own reason for existing.
Right. And that's like a reimagining in their own way, because it's like, let's take the basic idea, a lot of the characters, but kind of let's come up with a whole new version of it, a whole new concept of how this would play out. I love those, all three of them.
Yeah, and I know that it's technically a sequel, but it feels like a remake. Is Mad Max Fury Road? I would put in that camp. Their own vision, their own style, and something new to offer. You could claim the original Magnificent Seven is a remake of Seven Samurai.
I was going to throw out A Fistful of Dollars, which is a remake of Yojimbo, also from Akira Kurosawa. And Star Wars is a remake of The Hidden Fortress, which is not really true, but kind of.
Yeah, there you go. Also, I really like the remake of Sabrina with Harrison Ford, and I in some ways I actually prefer it to the original. I'm a huge Audrey Hepburn fan, but I think that Humphrey Bogart is less than interested in being in that movie. So I really like the remake. I think they did a good job with that. Technically, the Ben-Hur that we know and love is actually a remake of, there's a silent film version. I mean, I guess technically, I think it's based on a book, so I don't know how you want to. I mean, you could even make the same argument about Wizard of Oz, but it's all based on a book, so it's a little murky. But there was a silent version of Wizard of Oz. I like I would say a little hidden gem that most people haven't seen is the remake from the 90s of Mighty Joe Young. And I think it's underrated. I really like Charlize Theron's really good in it, and the special effects hold up, and I think Bill Paxton's in it, and I really like it. Also, I like the movie No Reservations, which is a remake of a German film called Mostly Martha, and both of them are wonderful. And I think Mostly Martha is probably a little bit better, but they're very, 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 very similar. Then my last one I thought of is I really like the Disney remake of Freaky Friday.
Yep, that's a fun movie.
Yeah, it's a fun one. It's got kind of a witty enough script, and I really like both, but I think it's a pretty good remake. So yeah, I think that when it works for me is usually it almost comes down to the script, and if they can kind of make it funny, make it engaging, and you don't feel like you're just watching the same movie over and over again. I mean, it's really hard to remake these iconic movies that people know so well. That I think it's better when you remake something that people are like, oh, that's a movie? I didn't even know. Right.
Well, that's one that was coming to my mind. I haven't seen the French original, but like True Lies, that's a remake of a French film that most people they never think about it that way because James Cameron is such he's the famous filmmaker. And so then, just True Lies, that action movie that he did. Ironically, I saw True Lies at a drive-in theater the same weekend or same night that I saw The Lion King at a drive-in theater.
Oh, really?
Yeah, that was like one of my double. I've been to the drive-in theater like 2 times in my life. It was like that night in Denver, and then in South Carolina, I saw Indiana Jones 4 at a drive-in with my wife. And so one of those nights was a better pair of movies than the later one. But just the way the universe played out that. The Lion King and True Lies, two such you're talking about formative years in my life that kind of define so much of what I love about movies in one night, True Lies and The Lion King.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like a good remake can actually introduce people to the original, especially when you're talking about these foreign films that people might not seek out. I haven't seen either, but I know that The Departed is a remake of a Chinese film, I think.
Yeah, Infernal Affairs.
Yeah, so that's pretty cool, and so it can actually help the original films. It's kind of annoying when I feel like the immediate response is, we're not even going to give a foreign film a chance. We're immediately going to make it into going to give an American reboot, but. Some people just won't watch a movie with subtitles. So
right.
What are you going to do? I do think that there can be some remakes that work, and it takes a certain degree of creativity, and there's no reason to a remake should be a time to celebrate the original film. It should be a chance to elevate it, celebrate it, introduce people to it, introduce it to a new generation, not a chance to downgrade, denigrate, the technology, the hard work, the things that they did in the original just to puff up your own new movie. And so that's where I get irritated about remakes. But this has been really interesting to talk with you about this, and I really appreciate you coming on my channel.
I have to kind of have one final thought if I were to have one. The way that sometimes I view a remake is the same way I would view a cover song. Because it's the same, it's the translation of music versus movies. A remake would be a cover of a song, and so does it stay true to the original? And is it a version I liked? Is it worth seeing, or does it just feel like disrespectful? So, like when it comes to like the Lion King, for me, I felt like it's not doing really anything new with it, but I like the novelty of hearing this new voice singing. It worked well enough for me, but I could see why someone else would be like, "Why does this even exist? This is just a bland version of it." And then I can think of some other ones where it just seems like all like the ones like the way you kind of described the Lion King, your frustrations with it reminds me of about 5-6 years ago they remade Total Recall and RoboCop, which are Paul Verhoeven films, which are like ultra violent films from my childhood that I just love. And they have such a distinct style to them that when they remade them, they made them PG-13. They kind of sanded off all the rough edges and did this big broad appeal version. It was like, you just took away everything interesting about this. Everything I love about this is gone. Same basic plot, but like where did all the magic of it go? And that's the ones that frustrate me. So there's my kind of closing thoughts on remakes, reboots, all that fun stuff.
I agree. I think you could say a similar thing actually to the remake of Ben-Hur. I didn't hate it quite as much as other people did, but it was just so bland. And it offered like all the things that offered new were not interesting. So it did not work. That would be another example. But yeah, so let us know in the comment section what remakes work for you and why they work for you and your thoughts. We'd love to hear, and you can contact us on Twitter, all over social media, and let's have a conversation. It should be fun. So, Sean, where can people find you?
You can find me on YouTube at Sean Chandler Talks About, or on Instagram at Sean Talks. And I try to be as active as I possibly can. And if you actually want to interact with me, I'm most active like with being able to respond to people on Instagram.
Yeah, so I'll have all that information in the description section. So definitely check out all of Sean's content. It's so great. And you can find me at Regionals Reviews, all over social media, iTunes, YouTube. And so that's a lot of fun. And also at Hallmarkies Podcast, definitely check all of that out. It's a ton of fun. So thanks so much, Sean. I really appreciate it. And we'll have to talk again soon.
Will
Bye.
Bye-bye.